Today we are discussing Charles Darwin. It is hard to overstate the significance of this thinker for the way we understand reality. Uh, he lived during the Victorian era of Britain's history, which lasts for basically the last 2/3 of the 19th century. And that's the time of Britain's dominance over the world, actually. So what had been brewing for many decades, the ascendancy of England in the Industrial Revolution, started to cash out in terms of its imperial power over the world. And that'll be relevant for today's discussion. And then when we talk about John Stuart Mill next time, we'll have to have this background in our head. So Charles Darwin was born in 1809 in Shrewsbury, and he didn't live in many places except for, of course, the important voyage we'll talk about in a little bit. He died in 1882 at Down House in Kent, which at the time was a few miles south of London. The question I want to frame this introduction with is, what is success? Because that's what Darwin's theory of evolution really puts before us. Even though the extensions of that theory in what we know of as eugenics by his cousin Francis Galton, which would have a very horrendous history in the following decades, in the 20th century especially, that can't be directly laid at Darwin's feet. We have to distinguish between the biological struggle for survival and any inferences that would be made for how we make society better, which is what the eugenic goal was, but it was perverted into the control, the desire for an elite to control a population. But the question of evolution does force us to think about such matters as to if we're looking at the development of the human species and wondering how it is that our genetic traits are either improving or degrading the gene pool, as it was said. Well, given the technological power we have and the ability to control populations in their, we see this with the pandemic, right? That the ability for governments to control populations, it's part of what we've got in the world that we live in. So, if this theory of evolution is in there, how is it that we can think about success in life in a way that is still humane? So the decisive event of Darwin's life, of course, was the voyage of the Beagle, the HMS Beagle. From 1831 to 1836, it circumnavigated the world, and of course, it went down the coast of South America and up to the Galapagos Islands. Of course, all along the way, Darwin was being very attentive and collecting hundreds and hundreds of samples. He was also reading the work of evolutionary geologist Charles Lyell, and that really was decisive. He says that the tone of his mind was determined by Lyell's work, and above all, it's because the time scale that opens up here. This was still a world in England where the Anglican official theology had, this was Archbishop Usher's calculation, that the creation of the world was in 4004 BC, right? It was a very short kind of time frame that everybody was kind of working in this modernist Christianity. Lyell's theories about uniformitarian evolutionary geological change meant there had to be millions of years involved at least. And so that just completely opened Darwin's mind to the possibilities of how processes could work over time. He had, in fact, gone to, it was Cambridge to study theology. At the time, you went to Cambridge basically to become a clergyman, an Anglican clergyman. He was studying there at first to do that. He still had some Christian faith, but over time, as he became more acquainted with the brutalities of nature, his faith slipped. At the time, Christianity was still officially the going concern. It was what everybody still believed. It's certainly in England, it controlled all the major institutions. You had to profess the faith, the Anglican faith, to be a member of Parliament, to go to Cambridge and Oxford and so on. So But it was not the faith that had been there for centuries. It was a faith that was based on a rationalist theology. So it was already shifting from a more supernaturalist to a more rationalistic faith. We've seen this in terms of Kant and Hegel and so on. So this Christianity was itself becoming something more pliable for the modern system of the world. Okay, so he had all this data from the Voyage of the Beagle. It took reading the Anglican clergyman Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population for the idea of evolution, the mechanism, to click in his mind. Malthus's thesis was, and this is famously in a way represented by Thanos in the Avengers movies, but the thought that the environment is only able to sustain arithmetic growth in population, but in fact population grows geometrically. So there's always going to be an outstripping of what's available to support a population. That struggle for survival is what made it possible for Darwin to come up with a mechanism for evolution. Evolution itself was an idea that was around for a long time. The idea that species developed out of other species, that wasn't Darwin's invention. What he gave was a mechanism and a mound of data to back that up. And that was all presented in the Origin of Species in 1859. That was itself forced because there was another man, Alfred Russel Wallace, who had written Darwin from Borneo, where he was, to say, I've got this theory. And he basically had natural selection in mind, laid out for Darwin. He was a very cautious man. He sat on it for decades. Well, that forced him to publish this book. The mechanism that he proposes is this: natural selection of adaptive, heritable, minor individual variations under the pressure of environmental constraint on reproduction, that's the Malthusian part, creating population level shifts. That's what the theory of evolution is. So it's under this struggle for survival. But that's the thing that's pushing things forward. And so the success of, and it's not the individual because the individual dies, right? The success of the population depends on adapting to environmental pressures including topography, climate, the other predators around, and the available food sources and so on. Everything in the ecological context that bears on a population. If there are traits that start to show up in the population, they get selected for if they match with the environment better than other traits. So success, if you were to just analogize this a little bit, well, there's only so many resources. You have to struggle to stay alive. And that, of course, leads to the thought of social Darwinism. Again, something that Darwin wasn't exactly fully on board with. He, in fact, for instance, opposed slavery to his great credit. One has to then make all kinds of distinctions, and that's, in fact, part of what one might charge Darwin with not doing when it comes to the theological implications or not of evolution. Because what really shook up the rationalist Christianity of the time was that the notion of adaptability to one's environment, it looked as if to all the rationalist Christians that look how beautiful everything is arranged in the world. It all looks, it makes sense. And Darwin was giving an account that said, it makes sense, but not in terms of a creator that has stuck eternal species onto an eternal world, or eternal species onto a world that's fairly static. Instead, what has happened is that there's this pressure of natural selection that can account for all of the branching speciation that we see. So that methodological atheism, which we grant to science, that in fact you don't assume that God is a causal agent in the story you want to tell scientifically, but the jump, which Darwin does make in his own life, is to say, in fact, that divine providence is not coherent to actually hold to. And that was a shift. He'd married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, who was a scion of the porcelain china maker family. He wanted to not frontally assault the religious beliefs of his wife and his culture. And that's part of the reason he was so reticent to jump in there. But eventually, he warmed to the idea of trying to deflate the creationist tendency, right? So the creationist notion was that God has to create the species. There could be variations in species, but there could not be the creation of species from one another. Variation in species was, of course, well known. You could see it. Whether or not and how well natural selection can account for more than variations, that's part of the issue, because, of course, a lot of what Darwin has to do is present a story, a plausible story about how one species is related to another. The trick is, in fact, to show that something that admittedly would take longer than most of us have lifespans to observe how that actually occurs. He did not draw out the full implications of on the account of man in Origin of Species, but he lays it all out there again because of his cautious nature. In 1871, he talks about, in fact, yes, that humanity itself is descended from animal precursors. Now, that's one of the beautiful things about Darwin, is to put us back after centuries of being in our heads, so full of consciousness, for him to put us back into the animal world. That's actually something that's very, very important. So the question here would still be, do we have to choose between religious belief and a scientific worldview? And that's, if we can't hold on to theology or religion at all, it is hard to see how that notion, survival of the fittest, which came from Herbert Spencer, for instance, the social Darwinian notion that, the mighty do what they will, and that's the rule of nature. It's hard to put an ethical brake on the success of the powerful if there is not another story going on except the survival of the fittest.